Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, talking about the history of climate alarmism and where it's leading us. George Orwell said, "So much of left-wing thought is a kind of playing with fire by people who don't even know that fire is hot." There's a news story circulating this week. Humans are causing climate change. It's just been proven directly for the first time. The basis of this story is a graph purporting to show global temperature and carbon dioxide since 1880. The graph makes it look like temperature and CO2 levels are tracking very closely. The idea is supposed to be that this correlation proves that we're overheating the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. There are several fundamental problems with what they're trying to claim in this article. The first problem is that correlation does not imply causation. There's a very close correlation between the position of the horse and the position of the cart behind it, but that doesn't mean that the cart is driving the horse. But the bigger problem is that the temperature graph is not credible, as I'm about to show you. There's actually nothing new about this research. The same graph has been on globalchange.gov for a long time. The graph shows temperatures cooling rapidly before 1920 and then rising rapidly after that. Now let's compare this graph to what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration said 30 years ago. Tom Karl was the longtime head of the National Climatic Data Center until he retired 4 years ago. In 1989, he said, "Analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent sharp rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979, Karl said. He was directly contradicting the current graph. Let's read this again. Most of the warming occurred before 1919, before the recent sharp rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So what Tom Karl is saying is that the warming did not correlate with carbon dioxide, and that Earth cooled from 1921 to 1979. The current graph shows the exact opposite of what Tom Karl said in 1989. Tom Karl said that most of the warming occurred before 1920, but the current graph shows that period cooling. And he said that Earth cooled from 1921 to 1979, but the current graph shows a lot of warming. This graph purports to show that the early 1920s were among the coldest years on record. But that simply isn't credible, as I'm about to show you now. 1921, 100 years ago, was the most persistently warm year on record in the United States. During 1921, 58% of afternoon temperature readings were above 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And the average afternoon temperature in the United States during 1921 was the second highest on record. And the heat wasn't just in the United States. Here's an article from the New York Herald from September 1921. Death for millions in 1921's record heat wave. Besides the heat wave and drought in the United States, there was also a massive heat wave and drought across Europe and Asia. This came right after World War I, when tens of millions of people died. And that was followed by the 1918-1919 flu epidemic, which killed 50 million people around the world and infected 500 million. Nearly 70 million people died during World War I and the flu epidemic. And that was followed immediately by a record heat wave and drought, which killed millions more. On October 3, 1921, the New York Times reported that Earth had a fever. They said the heat was a new record for 50 years. Many disasters of recent months ascribed to high temperatures and lack of moisture. They described a worldwide heat wave of unusual length and intensity. They discussed 2 million Koreans starving in Manchuria owing to drought-ruined crops. Drought kills fish in River Seine, and France suffers most severe drought in 47 years. In January 1922, the New York Times reported that 1921 was New York's hottest and driest year. Temperatures in 1921 in New York averaged about 3 degrees above normal, and rainfall was more than 10 inches below normal. And the New York Times reported that the heat and drought during 1921 extended all over the world. Looking through newspaper articles from 1921, there's all kinds of incredible stories about heat. 92 degrees at Zermatt, Switzerland at an elevation higher than 6,000 feet. The first 2 weeks of July 1921 were the hottest on record in Chicago. During the summer of 1922, northern Norway was experiencing heat between 90 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. This was described as unprecedented tropical heat at 70 degrees north latitude. The North Pole was melting, glaciers were disappearing, unheard of high temperatures in the Arctic. Glacier National Park was melting so fast that experts predicted all the glaciers would be gone by 1948. Ice doesn't lie, but government climate scientists do. They now show that the early 1920s were some of the coldest years on record, when in fact they were actually some of the hottest. Tom Carl was correct in 1989 when he said that Earth cooled from 1921 to 1979. But the temperature record has been completely corrupted by government scientists since 1989. They wanted to prove a correlation between carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and temperature, and this required rewriting the history of the Earth. This temperature graph bears no resemblance to reality. In 1974, the National Center for Atmospheric Research showed no net warming from 1870 to 1970. And they showed a very warm period from the 1920s through the mid-1950s, which has since been erased by government climate scientists. 20 years ago, NASA showed that Earth did not warm at all from the 1860s through the 1970s. And they showed that 1878 was the hottest year prior to 1980. But over the last 20 years, NASA has rewritten the temperature record and now shows a lot of warming prior to 1980. And the record heat of 1878 has completely disappeared. But the historical record shows very clearly that 1878 was an extremely hot and dry year around the world. The Minneapolis Tribune reported that there was no winter in Minnesota that year. March 19, 1878. Observations on the weather have been kept at Fort Snelling since 1819. There's nothing in the memory of the living or the records of the dead that give us such winter and spring as we have passed in the last 4 or 5 months. Indeed, we've had no winter weather in Minnesota, and the first spring month thus far has been more like May than March. Imagine the climate hysteria which would occur now if Minnesota went through an entire winter season without any winter weather. Burke, New South Wales, set their all-time record temperature of 122 degrees Fahrenheit during January of 1878. China had a famine during 1877 and 1878 which killed nearly 10 million people. There was a universal drought around the world, and both China and India were hit terribly hard by famines. January 28, 1878, Universal Drought. It's quite a new thing to hear of want of rain in New Zealand and Tasmania, but from both those colonies complaints have come continuously during the last 3 or 4 months of desiccated pastures and ruined crops. In the southern portions of New Zealand, which are disliked by Victorians on account of the prevailing wet and cold, hot winds have been blowing and water has been so scarce that in Dunedin it was not long ago selling at 6 pence a bucket. In the South Seas, the weather has been quite phenomenal. The wet season, which is anticipated with the same confidence as the rising and setting of the sun, has come and gone with almost no rain. Writing from Fiji a month ago, our correspondent informed us that the rainy months have been rainless. And from all quarters of the group, the same cry has come. Our plantations are utterly destroyed. The same abnormal season had been experienced at Samoa and Tonga. So it's pretty easy to see why NASA has erased the record heat of 1878. It doesn't suit their agenda. In their current versions of the graph, it's completely gone. Now let's look at some more recent data tampering from NASA. The red line in this graph is their most recent version of global land temperatures. It shows about 2 degrees Celsius warming since 1880. But another version of the same graph only shows about 1.6 degrees Celsius warming. These are supposed to be the same graph, JustTemp V4 land temperatures and JustTemp V4 land temperatures. Sometime in the last few months, NASA went in and changed the data. And if we go back to the year 2001, we can see that there's been a huge amount of data tampering. In 2001, NASA only showed about 0.5 C land warming prior to the year 2000. But in their current graph, as I'm about to show you, they show more than twice as much warming from 1880 to 2000. Here's the 2001 version of the NASA land temperature graph. Notice the positions of the circles. Now let's look at the older V4 version from a few months ago. Note that 1880 got colder and the year 2000 got warmer. And in the most recent version of the graph, 1880 got even colder and 2000 got even warmer. I'm going to cycle through this a few times so you can see how with each new version of NASA temperatures, the past keeps getting colder and the present keeps getting warmer. 2001, V4 version 1, V4 version 2, 2001, V4 version 1, V4 version 2. NASA is constantly tampering with their temperature data to make it look like more and more warming is occurring. Now let's go back 1,000 years. This graph was from the 1990 United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. It showed that the warmest temperatures of the last 1,000 years occurred around the year 1200 during the medieval warm period. The coldest temperatures occurred around the year 1650 during the Little Ice Age. And recent temperatures have been pretty close to average, with the warmest temperatures of the 20th century occurring around the year 1940. There was nothing in the least bit alarming from this graph from the year 1990. This graph was consensus climate science from 30 years ago. The New York Times published this article in 1992. Warming? Tree rings say not yet. Lisa J. Gromlich, who examines the ring patterns of foxtail pine trees and western junipers in the Sierra Nevada, has compiled a detailed record of year-to-year variation in temperature and precipitation over the last 1,000 years. She has seen in the North American trees the feathery but unmistakable signatures of the medieval warm period, an era from 1100 to 1375 AD, when, according to European writers of the time and other sources, the climate was so balmy that wine grapes flourished in Britain and the Vikings farmed the now frozen expanse of Greenland, and the Little Ice Age, a stretch of abnormally frigid weather lasting roughly from 1450 to 1850. She said, "We can now see that these were global climate phenomena, not regional temperature variations. The question is, how did we get those warmer temperatures during pre-industrial times when carbon dioxide levels are low, and what can we learn from those conditions about what is going on today?" The medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age pretty much destroyed the idea that carbon dioxide controls the temperature of the Earth, because carbon dioxide levels were much lower in the year 1200 than they are now. But something changed right after this article was written in 1992 in the New York Times. What happened is that a few weeks later, Al Gore took office as Vice President of the United States. Al Gore was convinced that global warming was the biggest crisis mankind had ever faced. His concern was caused by his own misinterpretation of Antarctic ice core graphs. In 1990, Al Gore said, "Any scientist who studied the Antarctic ice cores and did not consider global warming an immediate crisis was being unethical." So let's take a look at the graph which confused Al Gore and became the centerpiece of his movie An Inconvenient Truth. The blue line represents temperatures in the ice cores and the red line represents carbon dioxide levels. In this graph, over the past 450,000 years, you can see there's been 4 different ice ages. And there's been a fairly close correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Al Gore assumed that this meant that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was controlling the temperature, when in fact it's the exact opposite. It's been known for well over 100 years that the solubility of carbon dioxide in water decreases as the temperature of the water increases. So as the oceans heated up coming out of an ice age, they outgassed carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and thus CO2 levels in the atmosphere rose as well. Everyone who's ever opened up a warm beer is familiar with this. Warm beer makes a lot of foam. That is CO2 outgassing from the warm beer. So when Earth comes out of ice ages, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases because ocean temperatures are warming. And when the Earth plummets back into an ice age, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere decreases because the oceans can absorb more carbon dioxide from the air. Al Gore got the relationship between the cart and the horse backwards once again. Based on Al Gore's understanding of the graph, an increase of 100 parts per million CO2 caused a 10 degrees Celsius increase in Antarctic temperatures. His belief is patently absurd, as I'm about to show you. During the Cambrian era, 540 million years ago, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were 15 times higher than they are now, at 7,000 parts per million. Yet Earth's temperature was only about 15 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now. Al Gore believes that a 100 part per million increase in CO2 levels produced a 10 degrees Celsius rise in Antarctic temperatures. Doing some crude math based on Al Gore's belief system, temperatures in Antarctica should have been around 700 degrees Celsius. If Al Gore's theories were correct, Antarctic temperatures would have been much hotter than Venus. Now let's look at another problem with Al Gore's belief system. Note that ice ages begin when carbon dioxide levels are at their peak, and ice ages end when CO2 levels are at a minimum. We would expect to see the exact opposite behavior if CO2 controlled the temperature. Peak CO2 should have made temperatures keep getting hotter, but they did the exact opposite. If CO2 controlled the temperature, why would temperature start rapidly falling right when CO2 is at its peak? Hansen's global warming theory is based on the idea of feedback loops. The warmer it gets, the more carbon dioxide gets emitted into the atmosphere, and the more the Earth warms. If CO2 actually controlled the climate, temperatures would never reverse. Earth would keep warming until it became like Venus, or would keep freezing until it became like Pluto. Obviously, something else controls the temperature besides CO2. Al Gore's understanding of Antarctic ice cores is absurd, but he says that any scientist who doesn't agree with him is unethical. At some point, Al Gore became aware of the fact that he was wrong, so him and his friend Laurie David did the obvious thing, and they reversed the graph. Laurie David writes textbooks for school children, and she took the Antarctic ice core graph and reversed the relationship. She flipped the x-axis to make it look like CO2 leads temperature rather than the actual relationship where temperature leads CO2. Al Gore and his friends have been using children as fodder for his climate scam for decades. Nearly every schoolchild in the world was subjected to Al Gore's science fiction movie, An Inconvenient Truth. And he was given the Nobel Prize for subjecting billions of children around the world to climate misinformation. Now let's look at how the world changed when Al Gore took office in January of 1993. My good friend Bill Gray from Colorado State University passed away 5 years ago this month. I was fortunate to have lunch with him a few weeks before he fell ill in 2016. Bill was considered the world's leading tropical meteorologist and was the inventor of modern hurricane forecasting. Right around the time Al Gore took office during January of 1993, he gave Dr. Gray a phone call and invited him to a global warming meeting he was holding in D.C. Bill was a very direct person, and he told Al Gore that he'd be happy to attend the meeting, but he wasn't a big fan of Gore's global warming theories. And after getting research funding from NOAA every year for the previous 30 years, Dr. Gray's funding suddenly got cut off. He never got another penny out of the government. This is how Gore created the consensus. He essentially purged everybody who didn't go along with his scam. Every climate scientist in the world knows that their funding depends on towing the global warming line. Bill Gray was a man of the highest character and integrity, and unlike most of his colleagues, he never gave in to the extortion. He's my role model, and on his deathbed he asked me to carry on his climate legacy, which I've been doing for the past 5 years. He kept this picture up in his office of him holding an Al Gore $8 bill. Despite being the world's leading hurricane and tropical meteorology expert, Dr. Gray was constantly being attacked by his colleagues. In 2005, Dr. Gray told a U.S. Senate hearing that the talk of global warming is bogus science and media hype driven by scientists who are willing to bend their objectivity to obtain government grants. He was then immediately attacked by Peter Webster at Georgia Tech University and Kerry Emanuel at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. To his credit, Peter Webster has since changed his tune and come around to becoming more of a skeptic. But who needs actual scientists when we have celebrities to teach us about climate? Something else happened in 2005. On this date in 2005, Prince Charles married Camilla. And then he immediately started fear-mongering about climate change. He's been quoted by the press thousands of times on his opinions about climate. But Bill Gray, who is the world's leading tropical meteorology expert, never gets quoted. Even the climate alarmists at Weather Underground recognize the fact that Bill Gray was the leading authority on hurricane science. They posted this very nice obituary for him on April 17, 2016, but unfortunately Weather Underground has since taken it down. I used to visit Dr. Gray in his office every week or two at Colorado State University. He kept this post up in his office. Isa Blue wrote, I think it's time for CSU students, faculty, and alumni to flood the atmospheric science department with demands for a denunciation of Dr. Gray's unscientific stance on climate change. He's an old man now, and who knows where his head is, but being a tool of the climate deniers puts the reputation of Colorado State University in jeopardy. I used to walk the halls at the Colorado State University Atmospheric Sciences Department with Dr. Gray, and a lot of his colleagues wouldn't even look at him. He was a threat to their funding. Al Gore began a massive thuggery and cancel culture against any climate scientists who told the truth, and most gave in to his extortion. I'm proud to say that Bill Gray never did, and my friend David Legates is another one who never gave in to the pressure. Dr. Legates was quite openly blacklisted for telling the truth about climate. And last year the press got completely hysterical when Dr. Legates was given a key job at NOAA. The smear campaign against Dr. Legates by the press was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, and unlike anything I'd ever hoped to see in the United States of America. The press has no ethics, no integrity, and no decency as human beings. In 2008, the Oregon State climatologist was stripped of his title because he told the truth about climate. The last time Joe Biden was in the White House, Roger Pilkey Jr. at the University of Colorado was forced to abandon his climate studies when he was targeted by Democrats in Congress. Nicholas Drapella at Oregon State University was fired for telling the truth about climate. Peter Ridd from James Cook University was fired for telling the truth about coral reefs. John Christie and Roy Spencer at the University of Alabama had shots fired at their office because they told the truth about climate. The vice president of university relations at the University of Alberta was fired for telling the truth about climate. Every academic in the world understands the system of thuggery which Al Gore set up in 1993. And that was just the beginning of the corruption. Dr. David Deming was contacted by a leading climate researcher in 1995 and told that they had to get rid of the medieval warm period. Remember that in 1990 the medieval warm period was consensus science, but it ruined Al Gore's scam, so Al Gore had to make it go away. So in 1998, Michael Mann at Penn State University did Al Gore's bidding and made both the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age disappear. This was his famous hockey stick. What he did was made famous in ClimateGate emails in 2009 when it was reported that he hid the decline. Tree ring data showed that the warmest temperatures of the last 600 years occurred around 1940, and then temperatures cooled sharply from 1940 into the 1970s. This is exactly what the National Center for Atmospheric Research showed in their 1974 graph, a peak of temperatures during the 1940s. But reality didn't suit Michael Mann's agenda, so he simply erased the inconvenient tree ring data. He hid the decline. And he replaced the inconvenient tree ring data with bogus temperature data from NASA, which I've already discussed. Michael Mann's hockey stick was one of the worst pieces of fraudulent junk science ever performed, but has become the consensus because it's what the consensus needs to maintain funding. Now let's look specifically at the United States temperature data, which is extremely important. The reason why the United States temperature record is so important is because the vast majority of high-quality, long-term temperature records are from the U.S. This map from the NOAA website shows where they have daily temperature data for the period 1891 to 1920. Most of the temperature data is from the United States. There's also some from Canada, some from Western Europe, a little bit from Asia, and from parts of Australia. Africa, South America, most of Asia, Antarctica, and the Arctic are largely devoid of daily temperature data. Daily temperature data is very important because that's how temperatures are actually measured. Without daily temperature data available, it's very difficult to determine the quality and accuracy of any specific temperature station. Now let's look and see how U.S. temperatures have been changed by government agencies over time. On January 26, 1989, this was the front page of the New York Times. U.S. data since 1895 failed to show warming trend. A new analysis of annual average temperatures from 1895 to 1987 in the 48 contiguous states found no evidence of a warming trend. And here is the same story from the Los Angeles Times. Greenhouse effect question. Study finds no major warming of the United States. A team of government scientists has concluded after examining temperature and rainfall records going back nearly 100 years that there's no evidence of significant warming or changes in precipitation in the contiguous United States. And one of the authors of the study was Tom Karl from NOAA. Remember that he was head of the National Climatic Data Center for decades until the year 2017. He was directly confronting James Hansen from NASA, who the summer before started the global warming scare before Congress. Tom Karl was telling the truth in 1989, but eventually he gave in to Al Gore's thuggery, and he retired when President Trump took office, probably because he didn't want to face any questions. Now let's look at how the U.S. temperature record has been altered. This is what NASA showed in 1999. 1934 was the warmest year, 1921 was second warmest, and 1998, which was a very warm El Nino year, was more than half a degree Celsius cooler than 1934. But over the past 20 years, NASA has massively changed the data, and this is what the graph looks like now. They cooled the 1930s way down and warmed late 1990s temperatures way up. This was the 1999 version, and this is the current version. The 1999 version showed temperatures decreasing as carbon dioxide increased, and that wasn't going to do, so NASA altered the data. Fortunately, NOAA still publishes tables of the raw data on their website, even though they don't publish graphs. The only graphs they publish now are those of altered data. This graph shows the average maximum temperature at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations going back to the year 1895. You can see that 1934 was the hottest year and 1921 was second hottest. You can also see that there's been a strong cooling trend over the last 90 years in afternoon temperatures. But when NOAA publishes their temperature graphs, they don't actually use the measured temperature data. What they use is an adjusted or tampered data set. The adjusted or tampered data massively cools the past and massively warms the present to create a warming trend. This is the actual measured thermometer data, and this is what NOAA reports to the public. The measured temperature data doesn't in any way support the idea that carbon dioxide controls the temperature, but the tampered with temperature data does, and that's what politicians want to see. This graph shows how the U.S. temperature data is being altered by NOAA. Older temperatures are cooled about 1 degree Fahrenheit, and recent temperatures are warmed about 1 degree Fahrenheit. This is the real hockey stick. It's the data tampering from government agencies. And this next graph is very telling. It's the same graph as this one, except along the x-axis, instead of plotting time, I've plotted atmospheric carbon dioxide. You can see how NOAA is altering the temperature data very closely in conjunction with the increase in carbon dioxide. In legitimate science, NOAA would have altered their theory to match the data, but in junk climate science, what they've done is they've altered the data to match their global warming theory. Remember that this alleged relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature is the basis of this scam. Now let's look at why government agencies are doing this and who they're doing it for. Over the past 30 years, there's been a massive government effort to demonize carbon dioxide. They want people to believe that carbon dioxide is leading to a climate catastrophe. So what is it about carbon dioxide that's so interesting to government? It's because carbon dioxide represents energy. Here's an article from Bloomberg 2 days ago. White House considering nearly doubling Obama's climate pledge. The White House is considering a pledge to cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 50% or more by the end of the decade, according to people familiar with the deliberations, a target that would nearly double the country's previous commitment and require dramatic changes in the power, transportation, and other sectors. As I've been showing you, the demonization of CO2 actually has nothing to do with climate. It's about government seizing control of power, transportation, and other sectors. Through decades of propaganda, largely caused by Al Gore, people have established a link in their minds between carbon dioxide and temperature. It's like Pavlov's dogs. It has nothing to do with reality, but the propaganda campaign has been largely successful. So why is Joe Biden trying to produce massive cuts in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions? Even his climate envoy John Kerry admits that it won't make any difference to the climate. John Kerry admitted in January that the United States could drop off the face of the earth and it would make very little difference to the Earth's climate. United States emissions have been dropping since George Bush was president, while China's emissions have been skyrocketing. CO2 emissions are rising very rapidly around the world. What the United States does doesn't make any significant difference. China has a coal boom in progress. They're building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants. So what is Joe Biden up to? For the past 30 years, there's been one climate agreement after another, and it's made no difference to the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Even last year's lockdown didn't make any difference to the exponential growth of CO2. So let's take a look now at what the consequences would be if Joe Biden is successful in his efforts to shut down the U.S. energy supply. On February 12th of this year, USA Today was bragging about how wind power produced up to 2/3 of Texas energy last year. And 2 days later, the wind turbines were frozen in Texas and people were freezing to death. Texas government had foolishly listened to climate scientists. They overinvested in wind power and underinvested in the fossil fuels which they needed to keep people from freezing. Texas has since learned their lesson, but other states like Colorado haven't. I took this picture at the Rawhide Generating Station in northern Colorado on February 15th. The temperature was about minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. As you can see, there was no wind and the solar panels were covered with snow. The only thing keeping northern Colorado going that day was this coal-fired power plant. Here's a ground-level view of the solar panels that morning. They weren't producing a lot of electricity covered with snow at minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And besides the immediate problems with the solar panels, batteries also become pretty close to useless at that temperature. So any stored energy would have been unavailable to the public. Now let's look at how dangerous the thinking of the left is. This article was written in the Loveland, Colorado newspaper on February 16th, the day after I took the pictures. Despite the fact that their wind and solar completely failed, the Platte River Power Authority is still planning on going 100% non-carbon by the year 2030. The intense cold at their wind farms in Wyoming forced operators to shut them down. When ice builds on the windmill blades, it creates an imbalance that can damage the turbines. As it turned out, the wind wasn't blowing there anyway, so wind farm shutdowns had little impact. Solar resources were also of little or no help because the solar panels were covered with snow. The cold and limited sunshine kept the snow from melting. So they had no wind and no solar available, yet they're still planning on relying 100% on wind and solar. This makes no sense until you read the bottom sentence. The solution to situations such as this past weekend and what could occur in future years as PRPA and other utilities shut down coal-fired power plants will be tapping into larger networks. What they're saying is that they're counting on other states like Wyoming and Nebraska to be more responsible than Colorado is and keep their coal-fired power plants open. But if Joe Biden succeeds in doing what he says he's going to do, there won't even be enough electricity for Wyoming and Nebraska, much less excess to bail out foolish states like Colorado. People in Colorado will be freezing to death just like they were in Texas a few weeks ago. What Joe Biden is doing is completely insane. It has nothing to do with climate, and there has to be some other agenda. Remember that even as climate envoy John Kerry admits that U.S. emissions make very little difference to the climate. A few weeks ago, President Trump was run out of the White House, censored, and shut down. He no longer has a voice. His crime was telling the truth about what's going on in the world. He tweeted this in 2012. The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive. China's emissions are skyrocketing. Emissions across all of Asia are skyrocketing, and China is building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants. What Joe Biden's doing has nothing to do with climate, and it's based on propaganda and superstition started by Al Gore 30 years ago. What the Biden White House is doing is incredibly dangerous and threatens our future. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on this insanity for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.